say that I'm going to come at this somewhat obliquely, along the lines I think that Mohammed was already suggesting, but I think we might wind up very much in the same place. So essentially I take it as my task here to report at some level on articulations of Fanon's work and the questions that it raises within and around the field of architecture and urban studies and urban history, specifically with respect to the colonial and post-colonial city. So this is more of a, in some sense, thinking with Fanon as much as it is thinking about him, but with a certain historical specificity. So I don't presume that Fanon's work or his politics are immediately translatable into the terms of architecture, urban studies, or urban history, mainly because there are actually precious few attempts to do so in any detail. Nor, in the end, does Fanon himself have very much to say directly about the city per se. Nevertheless, it's my own conviction that such translations remain critical for efforts to understand urban space and indeed the geopolitical violence about which we've been speaking all day that frequently overtakes that space, at an aesthetico-political as well as at a socio-historical level. So as my subtitle indicates up here, this is really only a preliminary report meant to offer a point of departure for further thought and research. But there is, of course, a good deal of critical literature on the architecture and urbanism of the colonial and post-colonial city, but very little that connects the city to the ontologies of violence of which we've been speaking. And nevertheless, as the urban historian Anthony King has suggested, much of this literature has indeed taken inspiration, directly or indirectly, from Fanon's account in Les Derniers de la Terre of the colonial world as an apartheid-like, quote, world divided into compartments, native quarters and European quarters, a world cut in two. Algiers cut in two. Still, for all its richness, this burgeoning literature on the colonial post-colonial city, which also takes in the contemporary, quote-unquote, global city, has, with a few exceptions, yet to formulate truly generalizable hypotheses regarding the fundamental violence of asymmetrical, racialized, hierarchical compartmentalization. This is especially true when one tries to account for compartmentalization in something like aesthetic terms. And I do say this, I say this partly in recognition of Fanon's own attempts to discern the role played by literary and artistic production in imagining decolonization and constructing a national culture. Having, for example, in the concluding pages of Black Skin, White Masks, already dismissed the hypothetical possibility of, quote, a black literature or architecture from the 3rd century before Christ, as far as I know, it's the only time he actually mentions architecture. As this hypothetical possibility is more or less irrelevant to transforming the lives, as he says, of present-day child laborers in Martinique. He does not mention architecture in his reflections on a revolutionary and post-revolutionary poetics in The Wretched of the Earth. Nevertheless, there is a strong aesthetic dimension to Fanon's thought, stronger perhaps than his potent reflections on a national poetics themselves may reveal. So what I'm calling aesthetic here takes the form of an often perverse, tortured synthesis of psychosensory experience and political-economic reality that is captured most vividly, I think, in Fanon's wrenching case studies of, quote, colonial war and mental disorders at the end of Wretched of the Earth, so it's connecting the beginning of the book to the end. To which I will return briefly at the end of my time. To hint at the implication, let me just remind you that in the vast literature on the Euro-American métropole, the city of industrial capitalism, you will find time and again verification of the theses on the quote-unquote mental life of the metropolis, advanced by such writers as Georg Simmel, Dr. Benjamin, and Siegfried Krakauer, to say nothing of Freud himself. In architectural and art history, such arguments frequently extend into accounts of the dialectic of destruction and construction initiated by the modernist avant-gardes. In these familiar accounts, the metropolis abounds with neurasthenic strangers and distracted flaneurs, both over and understimulated by the abstractions of the money economy and by the jarring rhythms of mechanization. But rarely is metropolitan subjective experience connected by historians to the physical and psychological violence of colonials, despite the fact that we're speaking of cities like London and Paris. In other words, it's as though we have two literatures on the modern city, one on Europe and another on its others. Now, of course, I'm schematizing, maybe unfairly, but to illustrate, I just want to offer some details on a particularly esoteric historiographical skirmish concerning an ephemeral but architecturally quite significant episode, and in that sense, certain facts on the ground, so to speak, in the history of Algiers, a city that we can take, I think, as paradigmatic for Fanon in Les Damnés de la Terre. This is, again, the division between Casbah and European border in the late 19th century. The episode, this story, this quick story, predates Fanon's own Algerian period. It runs from, the story runs from 1932 in the immediate aftermath of the French colonial centennial up to 1942 when the Vichy government developed a revised plan for this city's business district and civic center. Beginning in 1932, the Swiss-French architect Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, better known as Le Corbusier, designed an unsolicited set of 5 master plans for Algiers. The projects, which are known collectively as the Plan Auguste, or exploding shell, so another, in a sense, perhaps internalization of the everyday violence, a priori everyday violence of colonialism. This Plan Auguste explicitly reproduced the colonialist doctrine of a quote-unquote Greater France, bound, oops, Greater France, so much for Greater France. Greater France as France. Yeah, so this is the Corbusier's sketch that accompanied his plan. So you see the north-south axis connecting Paris and Algiers. So he reproduced in this whole project the colonialist doctrine of this Greater France bound together by a north-south trans-Mediterranean axis. So this set of projects were followed in 1942 by a less ambitious 6th project known as the Plan Directeur, commissioned by the Vichy regime, in which the Corbusier by that time was serving as a minor official. Again, at his own initiative. He was politically quite present. So the first of this series, back in 1932, which is the one I'm really going to talk about, is the most well-known and has been widely interpreted as emblematic of tensions that came to define Le Corbusier's post-war production, such as that between the tension between, and these have been generally understood as characteristics of modernism, between geometrical and naturalistic formal languages, or between the authority of the master plan construed as a poetic statement and organic urban growth. The project, which Le Corbusier presented to city officials and in public exhibitions and lectures, was never realized and in fact exerted little influence over the development of the actual city. Nevertheless, its existence has conditioned, directly or indirectly, architectural accounts and discourse on the modernity of colonial Algiers, and indeed on many other North African cities. To begin with, Le Corbusier proposes in the project itself preserving the whole, nearly the whole of the Casbah, while I think you can see it better here. Down in here. Oops. Nearly the whole, he wants to preserve nearly the entire Casbah while replacing most of the French colonial district, which he criticizes. The plan's starkly geometric, in this case up and down, east-west axis, reiterates the older divide, but now vertically hovering over the Casbah, and in some sense dominating it from above to connect a new business center in the marine quarter down to the heights of l'Empereur, which are dominated, here again you see basically the diagram, the heights are dominated by muscular curves of bourgeois housing. In counterpoint, low down by the sea, low viaducts of workers' housing surmounted by a highway snake languidly along the coast, while both housing types consisting of frameworks to be infilled, you see one here, per the needs, abilities, and tastes of the inhabitants. So you see the modern house next to the Moorish house, and so on. So that's the project. Now, historiographically, the definitive account of the plan's history remains that by my colleague here at Columbia, Mary McLeod, in her largely unpublished PhD dissertation of 1985 and in an earlier article. In her dissertation, McLeod precedes the history of the project with a detailed study of the Corbusier's political sympathies in France during the 1930s, which gravitated toward a form of regional syndicalism dedicated to striking a balance between technological modernization and local traditions. Against this ideological backdrop, McLeod interprets the project's synthesis of organic and geometrical forms and its integration of the Kasbah into a syncopated yet apparently rational urban system as evidence of what she calls, quote, a commitment to the union of two cultures, consonant with the position held at the time by assimilationist Algerian leaders. In this reading, the Kasbah figures an organic vernacular that is echoed in the curvature. This is the dominant reading still of the project. The Kasbah as organic vernacular that is echoed in the curvature of the Corbusier's sinuous bars of housing, which absorb the supposedly rationalizing force of the main axis while imparting to it a purportedly Mediterranean lyricism. Though meticulously documented and carefully assembled, McLeod's analysis, therefore, you would have recognized, I think, reproduces certain tropes that have since been identified as belonging to an exoticizing Orientalist strain of European modernism, by, for example, opposing allegedly rational modern space to allegedly organic or traditional space. That, at least, was the criticism implicit, that criticism was implicit in the architectural and urban historian Zeynep Çelik's 1992 rereading of the Corbusier and Algiers plan. Çelik mounts a nuanced critique of Le Corbusier's Orientalist, gendered stereotyping of Arab culture, while gently noting McLeod's relatively light gloss on French colonial urbanism and its history is a subject to which I should add, as I continue to get in trouble with my colleagues here. My colleague Gwendolyn Wright has since provided a broadly comparative socio-historical account. She's written on colonial French urbanism, though not specifically with respect to Algiers. But in terms of the contested interpretation of this project, Çelik's real challenge is to the Italian architectural historian Manfredo Tafuri, whose influential neo-Marxist reading of the project in 1973, which failed entirely to mention the colonial context, has been an important point of departure for McLeod and for others. So in that sense, we're in the territory. This is kind of the point of Fanon avec Marx, or Marx avec Fanon. So Çelik is also the author of a comprehensive architectural and urban history of colonial Algiers that was published in 1997. There, notably, she introduces her study with two contrasting accounts of Algiers, illustrated by this aerial photograph. This is from around 1935. The two accounts she uses are one by Fanon in 1961, and the other by the Corbusier 20 years earlier. The passage from Fanon is taken from the celebrated chapter on violence in Les Dames de la Terre, in which he describes, quote, a settler's town as a strongly built town all made of stone and steel, brightly lit, with clean and even streets covered, with asphalt, on which tread the settler's feet, quote, protected by strong shoes, etc. While in striking contrast, what Fanon calls the native town is a world without spaciousness. Its inhabitants live, quote, on top of each other. Their huts are built one on top of the other. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, of light. The native town is a crouching village, a town on its knees, a town wallowing in the mire. To this, Çelik compares a passage from the Corbusier that's associated with his unbuilt plans for the city. Quote. So this is Corbusier in 1932, about 20 years before Fanon. Seen from the sea, European Algiers is nothing but crumbling walls and devastated nature, the whole a sullied plot, the European word. While in contrast, as the Corbusier puts it, the Kasbah is, quote, irrefutable in its consonance with nature, because from every house from the terrace, and these terraces add on to each other like a magic and gigantic staircase descending to the sea. One sees the space, the sea. So Celik discerns in these two excerpts two incompatible readings of the colonial partitioning of Algiers. While the history that she outlines, the actual history of the urban development of the city under French rule, which begins with the outset of French rule in 1830 and runs up to independence, demonstrates in vivid detail the stages through which Fanon's divided world was constructed in physical and social space. It's a layered history of everyday life that interweaves partially realized master plans with an evolving housing policy, a general ideology of domesticity, and the construction of regional infrastructures, to which Le Corbusier's heroic plans are barely more than an ineffectual footnote. So Celik concludes her analysis of modernist late colonial housing projects, which occur just at the end of her story, known as the Grands Ensembles, with a striking observation, and here's one, the striking observation that, quote, this is a longish quote from Celik, quote, the overruling intention behind the housing projects was to secure the French presence. Furthermore, construction intensified during the height of the Algerian War. Between 1954 and 1962, the French built more frantically than ever and in unprecedented quantities for local populations. Military action and large-scale construction thus joined forces in the war against Algerians. Their conflicting premises reinforced each other, but also displayed the dilemmas of France's colonial policies. Ultimately, the ideological agenda behind the construction projects would prove ineffective, as housing complex after housing complex turned into a center of resistance and even of military confrontation. Thus, architecture becomes a site for the enactment both of colonial violence and of its armed resistance. Still, one is left to wonder whether there's not also an aesthetic, or at least, as I was saying, a psychospatial dimension to this, that reaches beyond the stylistic or ideological confrontation between so-called modern and traditional forms in which these housing projects were caught, a tension that is supposedly exemplified by Le Corbusier's Plan Auguste. This returns me finally to Celik's critique of Manfredo Tafuri's indifference to colonialism in his reading of the plan in this famous book-length essay, very, very influential text, Architecture and Utopia of 1973. There, Tafuri sweepingly condemns the modernist avant-gardes for their complicity with and eventual marginalization by the dialectic of design and capitalist development, as he calls it, in which architecture can only, and rather famously, quote, ward off anguish by absorbing its causes. Though he was hardly a Mandarin, the anguish Tafuri had in mind was that of a bourgeois intelligentsia confronted with its own powerlessness to redirect capitalist development. His argument reaches its climax when he discerns in Le Corbusier's Algiers plan a quote-unquote crisis of utopia. This crisis is really a redundancy, wherein the utopian intellectual labor of the architect becomes superstructural. Thus, for Tafuri, quote, architecture as ideology of the plan is swept away by the reality of the plan, when the level of utopia having been superseded, in a sense made redundant, the plan becomes an operative mechanism. So by plan, Tafuri means not just the kind of master plans, whether by the colonial bureaucrats or by avant-garde architects, to which I've been referring, but rather the diverse techniques developed by international capital in its bid to manage the future, from Keynesian interventionism to mid-century urban renewal to the Soviet five-year plans. But what was the actual plan for Algiers, such that Le Corbusier's pseudo-rationalization of the city's infrastructures became redundant? For it could not be found merely in the annexation of what Tafuri's neo-Marxist language calls paleo-capitalist urban space into supposed modernizations like the Grands Ensembles enacted by the colonial state. As Celik and many others have shown, in many different contexts, the historical partitioning of colonial space combined dispossession with structural racism. In this respect, Le Corbusier's plan for Algiers did not become redundant when its proposal for resolving class antinomies through separate but equal forms of modernization was overtaken by actual plans produced by some mythic technocracy. It was redundant from the start, since it merely reproduced, and indeed was premised upon, the asymmetrical racialized partitioning of the city that was already well in place by the early 1930s. But, and in a sense, this is the hypothesis I want to offer, first in the form of a question. What of this bourgeois anguish of the European metropolis that Tafuri finds transposed onto Algiers in Le Corbusier's project? Here I can only suggest that Fanon's case studies of colonial war and mental disorders be set beside Georg Zimmel's classic essay of 1903, The Metropolis and Mental Life, to show that when we speak of both Paris and Algiers, as well as of the subjectivities they engender together, we are not speaking of polite communication and acknowledged aesthetic codes, but of a transcolonial mental life lived in the streets and, in the case of those militarized Franco-Algerian apartments, in the bedrooms of cities at war. Zimmel's theses on metropolitan psychic estrangement and the wider body of social theory to which they belong, which have informed so many accounts of the European and North American metropolis, run aground, I think, when confronted with the psychosensory world of colonial violence elucidated by Fanon. This is a world to which the modern metropolis is nevertheless irreducibly tethered, a tethering that lives on, indeed, in today's global cities and in many other places. Fanon's descriptions of this world, partitioned inside and out, have not been superseded by now familiar topoi-like hybridity. On the contrary, they remain capable of transforming our understanding of both the colonial city and the modern metropolis, as well as of their successors. How then might historical analysis, as well as accounts of today's proliferating forms of urban apartheid, to borrow Janet Aboulogad's term for French colonial rabat, how might we theorize such violence, its inscription in space, as well as on the bodies and in the minds of as well as on the bodies and in the minds of colonial and post-colonial subjects? Since I am unable in the time available even to approach this question, I prefer to allow Fanon to have the last word, and in a slightly modified translation, on the internal schisms or wartime mental disorders which belong to a psychospatial economy that defines colonized and colonizer alike. This is again from The Wretched of the Earth, quote, the chapter on the psychopathology of war. Quote, because it is a systematic negation of the other person and a furious determination to deny the other person all attributes of humanity, colonialism forces the people it dominates to ask themselves the question constantly, who in reality am I?